activities for housing and residential life staff. My name is Tom Ellett, and I work as the AVP of Student Affairs at NYU. Joining me as co-facilitator for the session is my colleague, Chris Stivic, RHD here at NYU. Today's session will focus on the understanding burnout and factors that contribute to the attrition of entry-level professionals in housing and residence life. We believe that the study and our findings may be beneficial when thinking about how to retain and support your entry-level staff. We have a pretty large audience today from all over the Glucuho region, so welcome aboard. We are going to welcome you and hope that the session proves worthwhile for you and the staff that you have present with you. But before we begin the webinar, there are a few housekeeping items we would like to go over with you so you can maximize your learning for the session. There's a control box. You will want to place the control box at the lower left side of your screen. To do so, please drag the top of the rectangular box to the lower corner of the screen so you can optimize your view of the PowerPoint. Keep the auto hide unchecked so the control panel would remain open throughout the presentation. The panel should remain so you'll know when the session is open for questions and be able to chat. If you click the double arrows, the box disappears. To ask questions, please type in the question box, which will remain open all of the time. If you have any questions during the session, please raise your hand by clicking the hand feature in the rectangular box, and we'll look for your note in the question box. Additionally, if time allows, we will unmute people or schools to join and answer a question for us, or ask us questions. Those who do not have a microphone, please don't raise your hand, but feel free to type in questions. Should any of you ever have any problems throughout the presentation, please feel free, in terms of technology problems, please feel free to type in the chat box and we will work to respond, or please contact GoToWebinars at 1-800-263-6317 for anyone who cannot get into the webinar. If you're here, I guess that's not a problem. If your team is using the headset feature, we'll unmute individuals during the Q&A feature, again, if we have time for that in the session. Hopefully this technology will work for you. We've done many webinars many times and had a great success at it. At the end of the session, we will post our PowerPoint slides through Glucuho online so that and both Chris and I will be available for email conversations and outreach. We hope that this learning is helpful for you, and we look forward to engaging with you in this topic. Understanding burnout levels and factors that contribute to attrition of entry-level professionals in housing and residence life. So what are we going to do today? Today we're going to go through the context of our study. We are going to give you some literature and history reviews, give you a little bit of job analysis, best practices, research process, and findings. Again, this is very much a research-based findings, information giving back to you, so hopefully this won't be too dry. Hopefully we'll keep it, I know Chris and I have worked on this, and hopefully keep it pretty lively for you all. So, the study, how did we go about doing this study? The study actually stems from an inquiry I started to have when I sat across the table from candidates at either a Kuhoai, a placement exchange, or other placement exchanges that I attended. And I always wondered, is this a career for them? You know, can this be a field as rewarding for the candidates as it has been for me or not? What are the variables that make a difference? And does burnout play a role, in what degree, in learning, leaving, and staying in the field? So Chris approached me on the subject and said, hey, love to be able to find out more information on your initial studies. So what we did was we reviewed the literature and the 6 studies that I had previously been involved in. I had won a Kuhai grant for $50,000 and had worked with some colleagues to look at factors involving those things. And so Chris and I then looked at the results of the former studies and created an instrument for this particular study on burnout. So we'll go briefly through the literature and then we'll turn to our study. So, deja vu. 20 years and a Kuhoai is still talking about research, and retention, and recruitment. It's been a long-standing topic of dialogue for people, and it actually received a lot of attention back in the mid-2000s. There was a task force that was established by a Kuhoai. Dr. Donald Kilbourne, one of the first Kuhoai presidents in 1951, actually stated in his State of the Address as new president, "Recruiting staff is our biggest challenge facing our profession. And for many of you, I would say the same thing. Is it still one of our biggest challenges? ACPA and NASPA actually created a task force looking at the factors impacting recruitment and retention back in the early 2000s. And a colleague from the Southeast Association in Akuho'ai actually wrote an article that talked about it in 1990, and he reinforced there are no two more critical areas than recruitment and retention of our staff. So, what are some of the history and literature? First of all, the Housing and Residence Life Professional Recruitment and Retention Survey report was issued in 2002, looking at differences between new and experienced professionals and their benefits. Belch and Mueller in 2003 did a study on pools or puddles, and that had really to do with whether or not our pools of candidates or were there really just puddles of candidates. Belch did further work on the quality of life, remuneration, interest in housing and residence life profession as a career. And you could certainly look at her 2003 journal article in ACPA's journal in terms of whether or not she found that were the case. And we'll share a little bit of that findings too. Myself, Steve St. Ange, Tom Schurman from University of Oregon, and Eric Nestor from Syracuse University wrote an article on what are the factors affecting recruitment and retention of entry-level staff, and it was put in the Journal of College and University Student Housing. And finally, in 2007, a 3D view of recruitment and retention looking forward and back, whether or not it was an issue. So those are a few of the articles and so forth when we think of the history of this particular issue. And I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Chris, who's going to talk about the 6 studies that were done through the Akuho'ai grant. We're going to briefly go through this. Again, these 6 studies help set the framework for the study that Chris and I will set out to do. Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tom. And good afternoon. So in talking about those 6 articles that Tom had mentioned, you could really pull 2 factors that you can separate out when we talk about retention-related factors. And we separated them, as you see on your screen, by work experience measures and career measures. When we talk about work experience measures, that means the experience that one has in their current position. Things that would be incorporated in that is job burnout, which of course we're talking about today, workload dissatisfaction, so whether or not people feel like they're taking on too much or too little, skill utilization, if people feel like they're using their skills to the best that they can, role ambiguity, how clear someone's role is, job satisfaction is pretty clear, perceived support, and professional development fairness. All of these things play a factor into whether or not someone is having a positive work experience. But when we look at career-wise, and as Tom said, we want to know if there's people who are in the field and are looking to make this a career, there are different considerations that people would think about. And so we talk about career resilience or identity, loyalty, and mobility. How hard is it to move up or be promoted? Does that mean that they are willing to relocate if they need to? All factors that one would consider when they are talking about whether or not they want to stay in the field of residence life and housing. So to move forward on today's topic and to discuss what job burnout is as opposed to workload dissatisfaction, we broke it down into 2 areas, as you see. Job burnout is something that occurs over time. It's not something that you just experience, at a month at a time or something. It's something that is built up. And essentially it means that there's a mismatch between the job design and the employee's skill set. Decision making, it can be chaotic or unclear, or the accountability is low. All of these things are factors that could translate to job burnout, which is very different than workload dissatisfaction, which exists when employees don't have the resources or the skills to handle a high volume of work, or if it's the workload is very high and intense for a duration of time. So when we think about applying that to our field, one doesn't get burnt out just in September and October when everyone's really busy with opening our buildings. It's something that would happen over time and goes past that busy period. And then just to define what job burnout means, if we just click one more time, Tom. There we go. Christine Maslach defines burnout as a sense of exhaustion, cynicism, and negative self-evaluations about the work experience. Maslach also identified work overload as a condition that can lead to job burnout. And Christine Maslach is one of the leading researchers in the field of psychology around burnout. It's certainly a huge issue in many companies and many fields, and that's why we decided to use her Maslach burnout inventory as the tool that we would use to measure in this study. But with that, we have to talk about the three areas I had mentioned: emotional exhaustion, cynical, and self-efficacy, because those are very important to the study. So when we talk about emotional exhaustion, it means that someone can't give at the psychological level that they are able to. When we talk about cynicism, that's someone's attitude towards the folks that they're working with, and it can lead to dehumanizing who they're working with, or making them feel like, you know, it's just another person. Self-efficacy means that it means to evaluate oneself negatively, and so they have one would have a poor view of their own performance in a job. So I think a good example, I'm kind of an example person, so just to give you an example, there's a great article that was written by Jennifer Senior. It's called "Can't Get No Satisfaction," and she talks about a professor. His name is Barry Farber, and he is currently a professor at Columbia. But when he graduated college, he thought, you know, I'm going to go make a change, and I want to work in the public school system, in low budget system. And he got a job in East Harlem in the 60s and 70s, and he thought, you know, I'm going to work to change the reading levels and make a difference in kids' lives. But as he did that, he found that he was actually dealing with more classroom management issues and things like that, and so he actually found that his input of work exceeded the output. He wasn't getting what he thought he would get out of the experience, and therefore ran into burnout. He was consistently putting in more than he felt like he was getting back. And so that's an example of how someone might get burned out. Great. So moving on to how that might apply to our field, work associated with housing residence life operations can put a high degree of strain on resident directors and other housing professionals. Definitely, housing leaders should really address these issues clearly in their one-to-one meetings, or even the way that they structure their jobs, so that all things are clear and consistent. People know what their responsibilities are, that they're never being overloaded with the amount of work, and that whatever work they're taking on isn't for a long duration of time. All very important things to consider. Housing leaders can also address this problem by recruiting and selecting staff who are better prepared to handle the unique demands of housing residence life. And then finally, retention implications as it comes to promotional opportunities are things that are to consider, going back to the career plans. So housing leaders are likely to have less influence over actual promotion opportunities, since organizational structure and budgeting, you know, are kind of out of our control. But housing leaders can also enhance the perceptions that promotions are attainable by ensuring that when promotions are open or they are there, that they're determined by clear and consistent policies and fair evaluation criteria.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. Next, we're going to be looking at another study that was done as it relates to the appeals that staff have as it relates to benefits. This study was done in 2007 by myself and two colleagues, Holly Belch from IUP, and at the time Sarah Bleiberg, now Sarah Klein, who was of NYU and now is over the river in Staten Island, working at an institution. So what were the things that that staff actually thought were important, entry-level staff, this was administered to, across the United States through a Kuhoi membership, and what were those things that people really felt were the most important benefits? And some of you may be surprised, some of you may not be. Health benefits and housing provided, very high on the level for benefits. Tuition support, furnished apartment, etc. As you go down. Flexible work schedule, very important, you know, in the 65% area. As you keep going down, gym membership, down to 40%, etc. And each institution is going to have the ability to do some of this work, and some not. Sometimes smaller schools have more abilities to work within their school and framework to offer some of these. But these at the time were the highest. I'd be interested to hear anyone from any of you, if whether or not you agree with some of these things. Please send me a note and we can certainly share some of that. Or if you have any questions on this as we go through, again, please feel free to put a question in for us. Our colleagues down in University of Florida, Norv Dunkel, with Maureen Wilson at Bowling Green and Holly Belch did another study in talking about best practices. So they did a Delphi method and identified the best schools in the country based on a Kuhoi membership, perception of best schools, that did recruiting and retaining staff the best. So some of the strategies in retaining staff were domestic partnership policies, respective living space policies, improving space, collateral assignments, very important, that I had the opportunity to work in student activities or multicultural affairs. 12-month contracts or accommodating flexibility should someone want to go abroad or semester at sea were really important. And PETS policies were important for our live-in staff. The processes, when you think about departmental processes, what works best? Involvement in decisions, attention to the individual, and having a broad approach to professional development. So maybe some of your staff aren't necessarily interested in being in a housing residence life field forever, and being able to have them do some other kind of professional development, whether it be outside of the field of education even, maybe a certificate program in hotel management. Those kind of activities could be very worthwhile for the individual. What were some of the perks in as it related to retention? Personalizing the apartment, having external entrances, a washer dryer, a meal plan, non-institutional furniture, and access to degree programs would be some of the things that were really important to the staff. And in terms of retention, a personality trait was really important, and when you think of that, what does that mean? Having a leadership in the top of the organization and supervisors really care about their staff, and just as importantly, have a vision. What does this department, what should it be, and how does it fit into the larger context of the institution, the academic institution? Leaderships that show a willingness to change. So we have entry-level staff who come into our institution with some really good ideas and good perspective and want to challenge what we do. And so staying in an organization will increase if your leadership is very open to young professionals' enthusiasm and ideas. Professional development needs to be encouraged throughout the work and through actions, and having leaders who actually participate in professional development. Now, we're speaking to the choir out there because there's a number of institutions are here. But in Glakuo, there's a lot more institutions who aren't here. And what does that say? How many of you have your Director of Residence Life or Associate Director at this webinar today? Or is it only entry-level staff hearing this information and saying, yeah, this is great, I wish somebody higher up would hear this? Staff ownership, real important. Exhibiting enthusiasm, which I mentioned about, and importance of the individual and the department and institution, knowing what that is. So we've gone through a heck of a lot of information in terms of the lit review of the things that we found. And so what I'd like to do at this point is open it up to questions, and I have a couple here, but keep typing them. First question that came in, Chris, and you or I can answer it. What are respective living space policies? What do you think that means?
Well, I think that means that we treat and respect the fact that someone's living in residence. It means that they're still living as a person that's separate from the rest. So the policies allow them to maybe have more relaxed policies than what the students might have, so that they can still feel like they're not, have different rules than maybe their people their age have. So, for example, allowing pets. If professional staff could have pets in their apartment, obviously students usually cannot. But they're an adult and it's a little bit different, and they might be more willing to feel like they can stay in the position longer because they do feel like they have a life outside of work.
Can I paint my own apartment? Anything like
right.
that.
Yeah, absolutely.
A great colleague writes in that I know, yes on flex hours, professional development funds. People get these questions all the time at the interview table. Thank you, Deb, for that. How do we address the desire by staff to have more input, more ownership, but they can't seem to do their basic work as a RD? Yet they believe they are ready for more. Chris, let me jump on this, and you jump in at any point. But, I think there's an obligation we have for honesty as leaders of a department, whether it be a assistant director or even an RHD, resident hall director who have RAs, and be able to say, listen, I want your input. Clearly, you're closer to the generation than I am. There's some things you need to work on. You want to do all these departmental committees, but let's get your hall to the way it needs to be, and having really honest discussions with the staff member about where they are and what do they need to do so that will allow them to be on departmental committees. Chris, anything further on that one?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, just to make sure that your house is in order before you keep on going. So, and I think the best way to explain that is to provide direct and honest feedback, but maybe providing some goals that if you achieve this, this, and this within the next few weeks, then maybe then you should look at joining a committee, so that there's a timeline that they could follow and something a little bit more tangible.
Yep. And we have a couple latecomers here, and the question was, will we have access to the PowerPoint? Yes, we'll be sending it to Glakuho, so they will be able to post it, and they'll let you know where it was posted. I'm sure they'll send a brief email saying, how did Tom and Chris do today? So let's move on to our next section. Let's talk about our study. Chris.
Sure. So like Tom said, we looked at his 6 studies, and I just sort of thought, what is this burnout thing that people keep talking about? Like, how do we know how burned out people are? And so we put together the proposal and asked for Kuhoai support, which they did generously, which was great. And the intent was to measure the experience of entry-level professionals employed in housing and residence life. So to talk a little bit about our methodology, the first thing we did was try to examine what questions did we have. So we created 24 questions that we thought would help shape what we think would tell us more about the entry-level experience. And then we used the Maslach Burnout Inventory, which was the 16-question survey that's sort of a standard within the psychology field. And so we put those together, and we first pilot tested the self-designed portion within our own department with about 50 people, just to see how they perceived the questions, not so much about the answers, but how they were reading the questions, which gave us a lot of great feedback, so we can go back and restructure the questions that we did. And then once we had that all set, we put that online and through SurveyMonkey, and we stratified a random example of a Kuhoai region. So 3 institutions that were small, 3 that were big, and 3 that were medium-sized. And so 9 total institutions from each region. So each region of Hawaii was represented in the study, and about 9 schools from each. That gave us a sample of 327 entry-level professionals and 174 respondents, about 54% response rate. Like I said, everyone was represented, and the quantitative analysis included descriptive statistics, chi-square tests of significance, correlations, and ANOVAs.
And I'd just like to add thank you to those who completed the survey. I'm always disappointed when you don't get a 100% response rate, although all my academic colleagues say, wow, 54%, that's amazing. So I have to stop being hard on myself.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about who responded to the survey first. As you can see, mostly public schools who responded. 83% were public, and 11 were private religiously affiliated, 5% non-private, non-denominational private. And in terms of gender, there was 60% female and 39% male, 1 transgendered, which was probably pretty accurate compared to the demographics of our field, which we were happy about. And then in terms of ethnicity, we found 79% were Caucasian and 5% Hispanic Latino, 4% African American, 2% Asian, and 10% were non-U.S. citizen or multiracial or other. So we categorized into 1. And lastly, in terms of educational background, we found that overwhelmingly the majority of entry-level staff actually have a master's degree in higher education or something related to higher education administration. 8% only had degrees in other disciplines, master's degree in other disciplines outside of that. And 25% of respondents said that they only had a bachelor's, which was also an interesting statistic, and 2% said they had just an associate's degree.
And I would just question whether or not people thought this was, to me it was a little surprising that so many entry-level staff were bachelor's degree. I guess the smaller schools, looking at that probably made the majority of that. And also thank you for the statement about not being so hard on myself for the research findings. So thank you to that colleague who put that out there. Okay, in terms of respondents' profile, so we wanted to know what are the history of these entry-level staff, where are they coming from? And so some of the things we found out was, and this may be consistent across, but co-curricular experience, 77% had served as an RA. I actually thought it would be a little higher than that in terms of entry-level staff who go in the field. So kudos to for our profession that are allowing 23% not to have gone the traditional trajectory of having to be an RA. So I think that's kudos to us. A little over 70% indicated they have been a student employee. And they, again, could have filled out multiple answers here. So that could be part of the 77%. Almost 45% participate in RHC or RHA or IRHC, whatever your campus calls it, the Uber organization for hall councils. So almost 50%. And then about 25%, a little under, served as an orientation leader in terms of their academic stuff. And I have a question here which I think is really important. Did you say you defined entry-level position number of years worked? Yes, we did define it in terms of number of years work. Chris?
Did we? Yeah, that's how we defined from 0 to, what did we say, 5 years?
Mm-hmm, we did, and we checked. They had to check off. They had to be in an entry-level position, though. So it was a position that required them to be the low level, or the first level, not low level, the first level of professional staff at their campus. And when we sent out this email, one of the things, Chris, I don't remember if you mentioned it or not, we actually sent the invitation to participate in the study to senior housing directors who said they would participate or not. And then they sent us the email addresses of their entry-level staff. So that was so once sample was identified, we reached out to people, and then they sent us the addresses of those people who fit into the category. So it wasn't just a random email to XYZ University and us looking at a database to figure out who was entry level. Good question.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're going to give you some data now in terms of this piece. And I thought this was a little bit interesting. The level of staff. So we asked questions about what roles do you perform. So cover up, we should have separated this way. Cover up the one side. Let's look at the middle statistics, right? What are the roles that this entry-level staff did on their campus? The highest one, crisis responder, followed immediately by committee work. A little surprising, maybe. Everybody's doing committee work, I guess. Good for you. Counselor, and again, we've defined what these were. Counselor, helping skills, certainly not a MA or a PhD in counseling, but having counseling skills. Supervising staff, conduct officer, program planning, budget preparation, advising hall council, room assignments. We had other listed, and people could type in, but none of them made the 50% or over. So these were the consistent roles for people who are the entry-level staff in our profession. The next question we asked was, or one of the next questions was, what does this role mean in terms of stress? Does this role create stress for you? And so when you make the correlations, interesting to note that, obviously, crisis response, pretty high in terms of, and the numbers of people doing that work. The next one high was conduct officer. So conflict, dealing with the ambiguity, things like that. And again, this is probably one of the more important slides for us to think about. And why I say that is, in terms of our training, how do we train our staff? If we know that crisis response is creating a lot of stress for people, how much time and energy are we putting into the training of crisis response? Similarly, how much energy are we putting in conduct officer? So training is one. The second one is support. What kind of support mechanisms are we on our individual campuses putting into these roles? And in some of our findings, and we'll talk a little bit more about those things. But again, I think it's really important, this particular, and it would be interesting for you in a staff meeting with entry-level staff, have them answer that question. You may have other roles to add, but asking the question, what are the stress-induced roles that you do? And knowing that information can really be helpful for people on a training committee for your department, but also for the vice president of the institution, of the student affairs, to realize, maybe we need to include more people in the crisis response function of our institution. Maybe some of the other staff in student affairs could be playing that role. What kind of debriefing might you need from counseling center to help your crisis responders?
Great. In addition to those factors, other questions that we thought that could, or other factors we thought could play a role into job burnout was size of bodies that people were dealing with. And so we looked at the staff, and we'll talk at the next slide about the population of the building. But in terms of staff supervision, you see the breakdown in front of you of how many RAs the entry-level staff would supervise. This was actually a field where people input their own number, and we categorize the numbers into field of 5, as you see in front of you. And so about 60% of those who responded have between 0 and 10 RAs, and 77% have between 0 and 15. So that seemed to be what the majority of people have, but as you see also 14% have between 16 and 20 staff members, and 9% have 21 or more staff members to supervise, which is a lot.
Absolutely. Again, as we have questions coming in, I'm going to interrupt at times to try to address the questions. So, we're going through the data, but I want to, because I think this is a really interesting question. What I hear from one person is, RDs often ask the question, what are we taking off their plate, right, when we introduce a new initiative? However, that isn't always possible, and certainly as you move up in the field, they won't have their supervisors take responsibilities away. Boy, wouldn't that be nice. How do we help entry-level staff understand that particular question? Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's important to just help. Because it is entry level and people are still learning how to balance all of these things. I think maybe the focus should be more on paying attention to their time management at the building level and seeing where they're spending their time and how much time they're spending. And if they do feel like they need to have something taken off their plate, that's something to examine with their supervisor, or maybe talk about spending a little less time on something, maybe not taking it off their plate, but just spending less time.
Yeah, and I would add two things to that. I agree with that. One thing I would also include in that is having them understand the bigger picture. How do we as a department fit into this? If we do this initiative really well, maybe there'll be new resources that come to the department, right? Mm-hmm. And the second thing, I think, as directors, we owe it to our staff to raise it up to the next level to do the concept of pruning. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with that concept, but here at NYU we do it every year. We look at our budget and we say, is there new initiatives we want to do? If we do, we need to find resources potentially. Well, we just can't go to the president and ask for more money all the time. So what we need to do is prune. Maybe there's some things that we actually do a lot of and do it, but nobody's benefiting from what we're doing. So that's pruning, cutting back some things that we really enjoyed doing. For instance, I'll give you an example here. We did, I thought, a phenomenal RA recruitment process. It was a 6-week class, a non-credit class that we offered. And when we lost 31 staff members a year ago, when we combined housing and residence life, 31 staff members of about 140, we actually changed our recruitment process to be a 3 to 4 week process where candidates were seen by many more staff members, so the bigger groups, larger groups, rather than the intimate 15 students for a 6-week process. Did it ruin the process? No, I don't think so. I think we enhanced it some ways, but certainly different than what we did. So we pruned back, I think, a really great process to be a very good process. Okay, great question. Okay, so now let's go back to the data, and we're looking at the information as it relates to, Chris just talked about the number of students in the building and the oversight. Let's talk about duty. So, what was the frequency in terms of how often when you did duty? And I was shocked by this answer, and a lot of people weren't that I've shared this with. 61.7% of staff are on duty 2 times per month or less. Now, I'm sure all of you, or a number of you, might be sitting in a room saying, sign me up. I would love that. But across the demographics, this is what we found. This may be very inconsistent with an individual campus, but nationally, this was what we found. So some of you could actually take this national data that we're providing to you and actually rise it up the flagpole and use it. You're probably laughing now in the audience. At least I know one colleague who's probably laughing at me. But this is the kind of thing you do with data. You have benchmarks. You benchmark yourself against the data, and you try to use it to benefit, not to take advantage of, but to benefit your students and the quality of life for your staff. So that's a little bit on that. Chris, anything on that did you think it was significant, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. I was really surprised, and I think it made me feel even luckier about our duty system because
don't tell them how often you're on duty, Chris.
All right,
they'll all want to.
But I think it is important to look at, to maximize the help that you have, but like consolidate to certain periods, because when you're on as frequently as every night, I mean, that could be excessive. Just the feeling of that you could be called at any minute can be a stressful feeling. And so the more that we can take that off of our staff and consolidate it to a smaller period of time, be it maybe once a month or once a semester, however you can work that within your institution. But I think from at least from my own experience, it seems that people would much prefer to do a longer period, a week at a time, and then not be on for another month, as opposed to once a week.
And the other thing too, I think, is if you can have your staff help create what it is, I think that would be really helpful. So lots of questions on this one, Chris. Oh my goodness, getting everybody sending me an email on this one. How do you define duty in the study?
Sure, we define it as a 24-hour on-call system. So responding to crisis via a 24-hour call.
Mm-hmm. And how long in duration? I think the answer is here, the 24 hours in duration was how long this duty was. And so it was every night, so the first column, every night they were on duty, 12%. 4 times a week of 24 hours a day was 4.1%. 2 times per week, 8.1%. We did make one assumption in that Monday through Friday that people may not be on duty, and this may be a wrong assumption. We're not on duty when the office was open. But again, that may not be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Again, more. What's the definition of duty? I think we answered that question. All right. Any more questions on this slide? Wow, not as many as I thought. Okay. Moving along. Oh, I hit the button too quick. All right. Surprise, surprise. What were they satisfied with their after hours on duty or on call, nights and weekends, etc.? Look at this. 59% were satisfied or very satisfied. And you're all going to say, well, yeah, I'm only on duty, 2 times per month or less. Yeah, of course. Those people, I'm sure, were much more satisfied. 41% were not or very dissatisfied. So, that's a little bit of the findings on this particular one. Thoughts, Chris, on this one?
Not really. I mean, I definitely wasn't surprised. It seemed like people were pretty, split on this. So.
And again, they really want us to clarify that last slide, I think. Is it possible to assume that 1 time a month responses meant they were on for a week at a time? No, absolutely not. Sorry to break the bubble. No, that was definitely not. We were very clear on our question and what it meant. More questions. Did this question, duty frequency, account for the differences in duty structure? 1 day on duty at a time versus a week at duty at time? No. We asked them to calibrate it over the course of a semester, etc. What would that mean? So, for instance, again, if you were on 1 time, it was over the course of the semester, how much did it equal? Was it a week? Was it a 2 week? Was it 1 night? Etc. So we were very clear on the question, so I do not believe my estimation that we are interpreting it anything else than what we got. And I'm getting thank yous for clarifying. Yeah, no, I think we're pretty clear on what our questions were and how we defined it in the survey itself. Made a mistake on a survey many, many years ago, and I said to myself, give definitions. That's the key for really good surveys. So I think we're really clear on that piece itself. Next one, living in stress. Okay, so do you reside in the hall you work? 94%. So we're still in residence life and housing, working a very traditional model. Any of you out there know a guy named Dave Butler? He was at University of Delaware for many, many years. A great guy, great professional, and then started working for EBI, Educational Benchmarking Incorporated. And he had this great presentation. It was called Then and Now. And he started off by saying, he would show a statistic and say, what year was this from? And everyone would say, you know, whatever, 2008. And then he would say, 2008 and 1965. Things have not changed for the most part. And I don't think that has changed very much at all, maybe a little bit, about living in a hall. And so, you know, should we be changing as we think of stress level? Is that something that is important for us in our sustainability of our future profession? The next piece is, do you think living in contributes to increased stress? And I say yes, we should think about it, because 61% say, I live in where I work, it's stressful, it's difficult, you know, maybe we could change that feature. There are some institutions that you live in one, you work in another. There are a few that actually have live-off entry-level staff. Not sure how I feel about that, but we could certainly check and ask you all to respond to that. I'd love to hear how some of you might think about that particular one. Any thoughts on this, Chris, that I didn't cover?
Nope. Sounds
Okay.
good. I mean, I think it's definitely important to constantly think about how we can improve our profession and really go with the times and make sure that we're improving with the student bodies and the things that new assignments that we're being dealt with.
Excellent. Living in stress. Degree to which living in a residence hall contributes to stress. You know, again, we asked the question from another standpoint, so we want to know the degree in which, and you can see this, you know, for the most part, 80%, 20% high, but the other 80% was fair, somewhat, not much, and not at all. Then we asked a question about supervisor and professional development. Does supervisor consider needs when communicating with staff? And glad to see it, 72% of supervisors taking into consideration staff needs. And this is something which Belch, Dunkel, Wilson found, as well as the retention and recruitment study. The importance of this particular question when folks are retaining at an institution. Next one is satisfaction with your level of professional development. Pretty high. 66% of those who were completed the survey felt that they were satisfied or higher with the professional development. Then my favorite question. All right, so we have all this information about these entry-level staff. What are you going to do 5 years from now? Right? Where are you going to be? Where are you going to be? 46% said, I'm going to stay in student affairs. The next high one plans to be in residence life. And then other things, plan on pursuing another degree at another school or that school, plans on being employed outside of higher ed, about 8%, and plan on being employed in a university position outside of student affairs. So ResLifeies, I would say I'd be pretty concerned about what we're doing when only 17.9% of us are saying, hey, we're going to be around. Who's going to replace us? Very, very, very small percentage. And I've done another study on this particular topic. People who attended ReLi, which is the Regional Entry-Level Institute, this study was done for Makuho and Nyakuho. They've done 10 years of ReLi, and so we went back for those 10 years, got a very high percentage, one that I was actually happy about 87% response rate, and where are they going to be? You know, where are they now after 5 years, or where are they going to be? Very high percentage out of residence life and housing. So something to continue to think about for us in housing residence life. Before I ask you, Chris, to think about this, let me go to a question. What is considered professional development? Someone asked, professional development was viewed and defined very broadly, something that would enhance skills or competence in this role or another role that you wanted to pursue. So we were very broad in defining professional development. Chris, any thoughts on this particular one? Because this is one of the biggies that we really wanted to find the answer to.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't have anything to say about it until when we correlate that with the burnout information. I think it creates a lot more interesting information, but I think it was a huge part, a huge question that was that helped us learn a lot about the profession. So we'll definitely talk more about it in the next few slides.
Okay. So now we're going to go to the second half of the study, and Chris is going to go through Maslach's burnout inventory results.
Yes, and if you could just, I think you have to skip bar a couple times.
Yep, but before I do, let me just see, I have a question on what does the gray area mean. I don't know. Terry, you want to send it again? I don't know which gray area you were talking about in one of the other slides, because I don't know which slide you're referring to. So if you remember where that is, send another question, and I'll try to address it.
Great. So again, going back to what we had talked about earlier about what burnout is defined by, we said that, again, exhaustion was sort of emotional exhaustion that you struggle to give at the psychological level. Cynicism is definitely having to do with dehumanizing the folks that you're working with and just seeing them as another issue or another number to deal with. And then self-efficacy is when one evaluates themselves negatively, which, as you see with the information in front of you, actually very high through all three factors, which is sort of alarming. When we look at especially high efficacy, where half of our entry-level professionals feel like they're not doing the job that they came to do, or that they're not doing a good job, that's a little bit scary. And so that's something to think about when we're supervising entry-level professional staff. And that can have to do with many things in terms of recognition, and going back to some of the other factors we said of, is there job separation from their personal life and their work life, all types of things that can have an impact on these three factors. Exhaustion is a huge part where we found the numbers were quite high also comparative to other professions. So you know, when 42% of our field feels like they're exhausted, then that's a little bit of alarming rate. And so when we took these numbers and we correlated them with the previous questions that Tom and I generated, we found some very interesting findings. There we go. So one area to focus on is whether or not size matters. We talked before about size of RAs we were supervising, and then the size of the hall that people were working with. And we found that three factors were statistically significant, which means that it's not these things that didn't happen by chance. As the size of the residence hall population increases, the Maslach burnout inventory ratings for high levels of exhaustion and high levels of cynicism were significant. In addition, as the size of residence hall population increased, so did the intention to leave the field. And so, you know, again, going back to the statistics we saw before, that people were exhausted and people did have a low evaluation of themselves as entry-level professional, we found that they were actually leaving the profession altogether. And then finally, those who had less than 10 staff members to supervise had a significantly lower rating on the MBI scale for exhaustion. One thing that we expected but did not come to fruition was that there was no statistical significance or difference between the college and university enrollment size and the MBI scales. We kind of thought, well, maybe a factor could be if you're in a large institution, you feel like just another employee, or if you're in a small institution, maybe you feel like you're filling too many roles. But there was actually the size of the institution played no factor in the MBI scales.
One of the questions we got, I'm not sure if we mentioned it before, but when did we administer the survey, Chris? Because there was some concern about whether we were doing it during opening, closing, summer break, etc.
That's a great question. We were very aware of, we wanted to make sure that we had the right timing. We thought November was a good time to distribute it because it's long after opening. Things have calmed down. People might have even taken a little bit of a break in October. And we thought the first 2 weeks of November was a pretty steady time where people weren't either, they didn't have nothing to do and they weren't overwhelmed. We thought it was a pretty median time.
Excellent.
Great. So what makes one stay? Well, we found if you were an RA before, that the staff intention states they are more likely to stay in the field 5 years from now at a significant level.
So that might mean, for those who weren't RAs, how do we train them better? How do we prepare them better to up their persistence?
Mm-hmm. Especially when we think about how we're preparing people to live in the building. People who were RAs obviously have gotten the idea of living where they're working, and they know what that experience is like, as opposed to someone who hasn't done that before. And so that might be something, a training topic we would want to consider when we start training our new employees. As the number of years increase for people in the field, the more likely staff intention to stay in residence life and housing 5 years from now. So the longer people were in this entry-level job, the more committed they were to staying in the field at a very high level of significance. And finally, men have a higher rate of intention to stay in the field than women do, which was an interesting finding.
The role of advising. Some of the things that we learned is staff members are more likely to have increased level of exhaustion if they advise hall counsel. It's a bit surprising to us. Those who advise hall counsel have higher level of exhaustion on the MBI scale, and also correlated with variables significant at the 0.04 level. Anything 0.05, is significant. Staff members are more likely to be satisfied with their work after hours work if they advise hall counsel. And again, it was 0.04 in terms of significance. Other findings. Staff who have higher cynicism and lower job efficacy, from the MBI scale, have lower level of clear expectations from their supervisor. Makes perfect sense. If I don't understand what my supervisor wants me to do, if they're not clear, I'm going to be skeptical of my job and where I fit into my job in the organization. So clarity, very important. Being on duty strongly correlates with career intention for staying in housing and residence life, but not at a statistically significant level. So if I wasn't on duty a lot more, it's going to be that I'm going to stay in housing residence life, at least for the data set we had. Staff members who work in more than one office outside, so the collateral experience, have a higher level of satisfaction with their position than those who do not. So I'm sure I'm going to get a question, though I haven't seen it yet. How can we do that? We need our staff. We can't afford them to go out to student activities or multicultural affairs, or, well, maybe there are some opportunities where you can. Maybe in a smaller residence hall, we have a couple of positions like that here, that people could be here a couple of years and move over to that position. Again, I don't know. There may be some level of synergy that you could create on your campus, but it's something for you to think about.
Great. So there were a couple things we expected to find, but we actually didn't find to be statistically significant. One of those things were the differences in burnout among staff and buildings with only first-year students. I'm sure as mid-level professionals we always hear, oh, first-year buildings have it so much harder, we deal with X, Y, and Z, but actually that wasn't statistically significant. We didn't find that difference at all. So class year within the population of the building did not play a factor. Difference in burnout in small versus large institutions, again, we talked about that a little bit earlier, but the 3-year myth, we always hear, you should only be an entry-level job for 3 years and you should move on. But that actually did not play a role in this. And we expected less satisfaction with professional development opportunities than were there, but it was great to see that people are actually very satisfied with the opportunities they've been given. And then, just to talk about where, further studies, what we could do with this information. Obviously, Tom and I had some specific questions and things out of our own curiosities based on what we read, but maybe some suggestions for future studies is to apply this to the entire field of student affairs. This is just residence life and housing, but it would be interesting to learn how this compares to other departments within the field of student affairs. Maybe qualitative study on what live-in staff at all levels do to find a work-life balance. What else should we be interested in knowing? Administer the same study at a different time of year maybe, other than November like we did. Moving forward, in talking about ways to deal with burnout or to manage burnout levels is to consider ways to reduce stress where possible. So compensation time or group outings away from campus at busy times of year, especially in August and September when people are just working. Sometimes you, as a supervisor, can maybe organize something during work hours that you pull people away from the office and sort of make them have fun, make them get to know, socialize with their colleagues maybe an hour before work ends or 2 hours before work ends as just a break away from the office. Or maybe you can afford to give compensation time, a morning off after duty, or giving a comp day after training's over, things like that. We talked about evaluating your own duty process, so we don't have to talk about that again. But staff-to-student ratio is definitely something to consider. As we saw, the larger the staffs got and the larger the buildings got, the more burned out and exhausted people were. So can larger buildings have more staffing support than smaller ones? A lot of times we talk about RA to student ratio. Maybe we should also consider professional staff to student, professional staff to staff ratio. We've learned that RAs are excellent candidates. As we talked about earlier, they have the idea of living where they're working down, so they seem to be a better pool to recruit from. Encourage responsibilities with other student affairs offices, as Tom spoke about, and then providing more training and support with crisis response. Just to give you an idea of what other fields do to combat burnout, I think some very interesting things. Intel actually does a sabbatical every 7 years. Obviously, entry-level staff are generally not around for 7 years at a time. Some are, but they actually give a sabbatical for a few months if they've been around for 7 years. Something maybe a little bit more tangible for our field would be when there are people who are professionals are working more than 60 hours a week, they're considered in the red zone, and they're mandated to meet with a counselor for a half hour to discuss their time management and to de-stress all that they've kind of been handling. Another company has a no meetings week once a quarter. So every quarter, financial quarter is the financial company. They don't allow meetings to happen and just focus on your own work. So that way people aren't constantly running around and trying and sometimes creating more work for themselves. So that's just some other things that people outside of residence life and housing, some things people are doing to make sure that their staff aren't being burned out.
Chris, I have a question from someone regarding generational differences or gender differences in our findings.
I'm sorry, around gender differences?
Correct.
What is there something?
I'm sorry. Did we find any? We didn't find any. In terms of that piece.
In terms of burnout, no. In terms of like the burnout levels from gender identities did not change. There was a 60% to 40% ratio of women to men, but there was nothing in terms of data that found one gender, a significance between genders, basically.
The only difference was that men would be more likely to stay in the field.
Correct. Yes.
So that was the only finding. We ran every kind of correlation you could think of, and ANOVA, et cetera. We just couldn't find anything. Which, when we started this process, Chris and I, we really hoped to have the major findings, like as you mentioned earlier, first-year students, whatever it might be, so that you would think about staffing differently. We didn't find them, at least in this data set. Certainly, this study could be replicated again and look to see if, with some tweaks, to see if there are some differences. But, we just haven't found the differences in this particular data set. But great question and great thing to think about. Is there a difference? Well, that is really kind of the sum of our study. We certainly have the data set, and any of you would-be dissertationites who are thinking about being a doctoral student, certainly we'd be glad to chat with any of you who are interested in doing that kind of study or anything further with burnout or retention, recruitment, and entry-level staff. I've had the benefit of being involved in now 8 studies involving entry-level staff, so I feel like not that I'm the expert in it, certainly I have a perspective on it. And so I'd be glad to share any of that data with you. There is also a site, a website that is administered through Kuhoi that has all of the studies, all of the presentations, and all of the articles that were generated from the $50,000 the grant that we had won. And if any of you want that, certainly have that and be glad to send it to you all in case of you wanting further information or further studies or thoughts about it. At this point, I'll open it up for questions or any chats that any of you have. Chris and I will stay around for a little bit, but it was a pleasure for a non-Glakuho persons to come and visit the Great Lake area and share some of our thoughts and findings with you all. Congratulations to Glakuho for doing this kind of professional development series. I think it adds value to your development, and hopefully today's presentation will spark some ideas and some ways to change some of our focus and ways that we address our staffing and how we deal with professionals at the entry-level mark. Any closing comments, Chris?
No, I also just want to thank Glakuho for inviting us to join you today. I'm really excited. And if anyone's going to be at the ACPA curriculum conference, I hope to meet you there. It'll be in your region in Minnesota, St. Paul, in next month, so I'd love to meet you. But again, thank you so much for having us, and I hope that you learned anything. Feel free to email either of us if you have any questions or want to know more.
Have a good day, and thanks for being with us.